Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. What a treat it is to have this technology to share some insights and lessons learned to help hundreds of associations from all across the country, from here in the convenience of my office and your office, all be better prepared for the future. Components form the foundation of every reserve study. They're the factors that make or break your reserve plan. And you indicated in the introductory poll that many of you have either moderate or significant concerns. So in this Reserve Studies 101 program, we're going to help you avoid mistakes and move your association towards an improved future. That's what we're known for here at Association Reserves, and it's a great outcome for investing an hour of your day. As Paige indicated, this course is now approved for CE credit through CAM-ICB, Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, and the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. For all of you seeking CE credit, again, a reminder, please give Paige a week to get certificates of completion to you. I like an interactive presentation, so because everyone's been muted, every once in a while I may ask for your feedback, and the way to respond is to raise your hand electronically by clicking the hands raised icon on your control panel. Looks like the one that you see on screen. And if you came with a question, or if at any time you have a question that arose from something I've said, just type it in the dialog box in your control panel. Again, similar to what you see on screen. Paige will be monitoring that, and we'll select from those at the end during our Q&A time. Well, I hope you're ready to take notes, but like all our webinars, we're recording this session. So it will soon be available on YouTube and reservestudy.com for future playback. And for everyone who stays to the end and fills out our short end of session survey, we'll send an outline of today's program. So please fill out that survey, making sure you add some comments about what you'd like to hear in future webinars. Those comments shape our presentations and help us create new programs. So without further delay, grab your mouse and click on the hands raised icon if you're ready for me to get going on today's presentation. I'm seeing lots of hands up. So everyone's getting the drift of how we're doing this. Okay, I'm going to click hands down. And on we go to content. Last week, I had 5 business meetings in 3 days in 2 cities. It took me some time to get organized about, as you can imagine, who I was meeting with, who was going to be there, refreshing my understanding of the meeting objectives, what materials I needed to bring, how to prepare, what kind of dress was appropriate for each of the different meetings, making sure I had all the addresses and times correct, enough time to get from one to the other, and what the weather was like in each city. Planning ahead paid off with a successful trip for me and no last-minute gotchas. And reserve expenses are actually a lot like that. They are in your future, and they are complicated. They're a different set of repair and replacement projects with different timing. Your best strategy is to identify them so you have time to prepare. And this is why getting the component list correct is essential. The future brings its own set of surprises, so preparing as well as you can pays off. In a business setting, it might be bad traffic, or a key person who can't make it to the meeting, or running low on your battery and your cell phone so you can't get your navigation going. In reserves, it's going to be a roof project that happens early, or an expense you hadn't anticipated. So let's talk about becoming prepared with a good reserve component list. Whether you're the board or the manager, and we have a good mix here today, you've got decisions to make. All association assets are in a constant state of deterioration, and years of planning are going to help you prepare for those big bills. Surprises are problems. So let's set you up with good planning information, an accurate reserve component list that will give you and your association an advantage over all the other associations who don't plan ahead. Let them be the ones who suffer from surprises and the special assessments and deferred maintenance and lagging property values that come along with those surprises. Well, this is a graph showing typical reserve expenses through the years. They look irregular and random. You can see high expenses and low expenses, but I'll show you that they are very predictable. looking forward 20 or 30 years or more gives you plenty of time to prepare. And there's going to be plenty of surprises in life, but reserve expenses shouldn't be one of them. To set the stage, let me remind you that every reserve study has 3 parts. You see them on screen: the reserve component list, calculation of reserve fund strength, and a calculated reserve funding plan. We're going to cover just the component list today, which forms the foundation for the other 2 parts of the reserve study. We have 2 other webinars in this series, Reserve Studies 102 and 103, where we address those other parts of the reserve study. Watch your email and learn when those will be presented, or for the impatient ones out there, you can just jump to the recorded ones on reservestudy.com or on YouTube. The material I'll be covering today is all based on National Reserve Study standards, first published back in 1998. And here's where we get to the main focus of today's session. Those National Reserve Study standards give us a stable 4-part test to determine which projects should be included in your reserve study. Here's the test, and if you're taking notes, this is key. To be included in your reserve component list, a project needs to pass all 4 parts of this test. It needs to be a common area maintenance responsibility, meaning not private property or owned or maintained by another entity. And it needs to have a limited useful life, not be something that's expected to effectively last forever. And it needs to have a predictable remaining useful life. If you can't anticipate when it will need to be replaced, if you can't put a year on it, then by definition it's unpredictable and you can't plan for it in the reserve budget. It will be a surprise. And finally, the project needs to be above a minimum threshold of significance. In other words, it needs to be more expensive than what could easily be absorbed into your ongoing operational budget. And that threshold, I think you'll find, is often in the range of 0.5% to 1% of your annual budget. That's typically the range we see among our clients. And again, if it doesn't pass all 4 elements of the 4-part test, it shouldn't appear in your reserve study. With this test, your reserve funds will be used to repair or replace only common area components with a useful life, predictable remaining useful life, and with a significant, at least to your association, repair or replacement cost. And that's a good plan. There is no industry master list or list proprietary to a particular reserve study professional. If you're trying to follow a list, you're always going to miss something. So this 4-part test gives you a sift that allows you to look at anything and then, going through the 4-part test, decide if or not that component should appear in your reserve study. And the good thing is this 4-part test applies to all associations. You can focus on the association, not the list. So it works for new townhomes, high-rises, older associations, and exotics. Deterioration is inevitable and it's ongoing. Nothing you can do about that. The reserve projects that we're dealing with are very predictable. The reserve component list allows boards and their managers to responsibly prepare. This meets their obligation to collect and spend the funds necessary to operate and sustain the association. So, join me in a few minutes as I take you on an imaginary walk around a few associations, showing you pictures of how this works. Hopefully you'll get an idea of how this can work for your association. So for each example, practice going through the 4-part test. If it's a common area maintenance responsibility with a limited life, I hope you can start to feel it in your brain, predictable remaining useful life, and above a threshold cost of significance. All right, here we go. At this association, the governing documents say air conditioning condensers are private property. So, at this association, these air conditioning condensers fail test number 1 and should not appear in the component list. This association has concrete underground parking. This structural element is expected to practically last forever, so because it doesn't have a limited useful life, it fails test number 2 and shouldn't appear in the reserve component list. And in that same garage floor is a sump pump. This is a common area component that is critical, pumping water up from a catch catch point at the lowest point in the garage up to the street level drains. Now, nobody that I met during my inspection had ever heard it run, but the garage never flooded, so we know it must be working. Building engineer said it's never been replaced in the 10 years since he's been there. A pump like this typically has a useful life of about 10 to 15 years. So the association should be ready to replace it at any time. So in this case, we set the remaining useful life at 0. Now, we're not certain, but it's a reasonable expectation. So the lesson here is start getting comfortable making estimates. We're predicting the future, so we're going to have to make some estimates. Now let's go up to the roof. On this flat roof is a small hallway ventilator. And while you can see some rust clearly on the housing, inside is a very simple motor, fan, and belt. The association fixes this ventilator as needed as a minor operational expense. So it fails test number 4 and shouldn't appear in the reserve component list. Okay, everyone with me? Give me a show of hands if you're starting to see how this 4-part test works. Show of hands. Good, good, good. Okay, you're getting it. As we look around, we're going to start sifting with this 4-part test. Okay, I'm going to put hands down. All right, now that you see how it works, let me step it up a notch and let's apply it to some tougher situations. Okay, here's a photo looking at the ceiling of an underground garage. This association has put up some sheet metal gutters under the piping in the ceiling because of leaks. Now let's go through the 4-part test. Is plumbing a common area maintenance responsibility? Yes. Does it have a useful life? Well, obviously, because it's deteriorated and failing. Does it have a predictable remaining useful life? Yes. In fact, I think it hit 0 probably a couple of years ago when they put up the gutter. And do you expect repiping to be above a minimum cost? Absolutely. So repiping the garage is clearly an appropriate reserve project. Here's a picture of a hillside that just experienced a large slope failure. It may not look like a big deal, just, throw the dirt back up on the hill, but they just got a $50,000 estimate to regrade the slope and replant it. So the question is this a reserve component? Well, 4-part test. Nobody knew this particular hillside was going to fail, but this large association has extensive hills. And over their 20 years, this is the 4th time a hill somewhere or other has slipped. So they realized that their original sloping was a little too steep. So the math here is that a hillside at this association slips on average about once every 5 years. They might not know exactly where, but their history suggests that if it happened before, it's likely to happen again, and it's reasonable to expect every 5 years or so. So we advise this association to have a line item for hillside replacement every 5 years. Let your own history help you prepare for your future. Okay, back to the reserve component test. The 4 parts, you see them. Hopefully you're getting to memorize them. And let me take a quick break from what I'm teaching and ask you guys a question. How far, Paige, could you launch the poll? How far into the future should you plan for a reserve project?
All right, go ahead and make your selection. Give it a couple more seconds. Okay, Robert, it looks like 55% say 30 years, and the next one says 20 years, next group. So
good, okay. Pretty good answers. Note here on the 4-part test that there's no maximum year limit. Projections obviously get fuzzier and fuzzier the further you go out into the future, but often you have some major projects like roofing or siding or elevator modernization that are very significant and very predictable. So it's wise to prepare for these expensive projects with as many years as possible. If you're pretty certain that something's going to happen 35 years out, by all means, add it to your reserve component list. There's no magic threshold of 20 years or 30 years. So as you stick that number out there, that way you're able to start planning for the project, and you'll have plenty of time to refine your estimates as the time to replace draws near. Okay, let's talk about the list itself. Once you've gathered this information, what information should you see for each component? Let me say that clear. What information do we gather, and what information do you see? First, it needs to be described accurately. Reserve components are projects, not things. So don't expect to see a line item described as fence. Expect it to say fence replace or fence repaint. This is because it's possible and common to have more than one project for an asset. So for each component, expect to see the following information. Identifying information. That's typically quantity, but it could also mean a serial number, maybe a size like a BTU, heat capacity rating of a water or pool heater, maybe the horsepower of a particular pump. And then, of course, we expect to see the useful life in years, remaining useful life also in years, and the current replacement cost. Note here that we're going to inflate these costs in the financial analysis portion of the reserve study, and it's there that we look out to future years. But here in the component list, all we show is current costs. This is what we expect at this point in time. Let's look at the simplified reserve component list. I've taken out the quantity field just for space, and here you can see a clear description of the project. If you look halfway down, you can see two line items for asphalt. One is a seal project every 5 years, one's a resurface project every 20 years. And you can see values for useful life, which is UL, remaining useful life, which I've abbreviated RUL, and of course the project's current replacement cost. Now, per National Reserve Study standards, a remaining useful life of 0 indicates a project that needs to be done in the initial year. Its life has all expired. So you look here, all the projects are very reasonable and predictable. Pool furniture, pool resurface, roofing, asphalt, repainting the building, elevator modernization, hallways, all very normal type stuff. And let me just suggest that a reserve component list for a small association is going to likely have a different makeup than one for a large association because of that threshold. Some components that are significant to a small association may fall off the list as insignificant for a larger association. Okay, the component list shows the scope of your reserve projects. The scope is the type of projects they are and how expensive they're going to be. And it also shows the schedule, when those projects are expected to occur and recur over the years. And the result is a map of those expenses. It's going to be different for each association. It changes over the years as the projects draw closer and you have different estimates. And remember, irregular does not mean unpredictable. These are all very predictable and reasonable projects. Now, in reality, you and I know that as the years go by, these expenses will move around a little bit and get slightly larger or smaller as we refine our estimates. So your best chance for having the funds when you need them is to update your plan regularly. Okay, while a typical reserve component list may contain 20 to 50 items, not all reserve components are equally significant. Typically, just a few components dominate your reserve study. So out of the 20 or 50 in a typical reserve study, take a moment to think, how many do you think dominate the financial analysis? Pick a number. What we find is the answer is typically 5 or less. It's a wonderfully small number, and often the number is even only 2 or 3. It's kind of like ships in a harbor. You don't want to just count ships and mistakenly consider the aircraft carrier as just another ship. Your association type and the region of the country are going to affect your particular influential components, but for a typical townhome association, the dominant components are going to be roofing, painting, and asphalt. In cooler or moist climates, you can add siding on window or maybe deck replacements. And then in mid-rise or high-rise condos, you typically don't have as much asphalt or roofing, but you do have major interior hallway projects and major mechanical components like HVAC, boilers, elevators, fire alarm systems, those kinds of things. And in HOAs or planned developments, it's usually the roadway system and recreational components. And here's how you separate the influential ones from the others. The most significant components are often not the ones with the largest replacement cost. Significance is cost per year. And let me illustrate. Let's compare a $100,000 roof project that happens every 25 years. That project is deteriorating at the rate of about $4,000 a year. But a project that's half as expensive, a $50,000 repaint project, if it happens every 5 years, that's deteriorating at the rate of $10,000 a year. So that's much more significant. So don't get distracted just by the large cost. It's cost per year that defines an influential project. So that's a summary of the component list. It's all driven by the 4-part test. So again, grab your mouse and give me a hands raised click to show me you're ready to change course and talk about getting you ready to face the most common issues related to your component list. Hands raised. Okay, let's stop talking about the component list and let's start talking about you. Okay, the first question is what to do, like it says in the top left, when a component is missing. Can you spend your reserve cash on something that doesn't appear in your reserve study? And the answer is yes. The answer is that reserve projects are defined by National Reserve Study standards and the 4-part test, not your reserve component list. Hopefully they appear in your reserve component list. That's the way it's supposed to be, but the definition is the 4-part test. So if that occurs, spend the money from reserves and make sure to add that project to reserve component list in your next update. And it's okay to have multiple components for the same physical asset. And this is common when you have different ages of an asset due to phased construction or reconstruction. Remember from the 4-part test that a component needs a distinct remaining useful life. So, for example, if your roofing was installed years apart in 3 distinct phases, like in this slide, then roof replacement should be listed as 3 separate components in your reserve study. It's okay and it's appropriate to do that. And let's suppose you have a whole lot of something, like perimeter fencing and sidewalks. They're common examples. Due to local factors like sprinklers, trees, traffic patterns, or vegetation, you'll likely find the need for scattered partial replacements. And while you may not know the exact location, kind of like that hillside I mentioned a few moments ago, you know that every few years you need some money to keep the asset in good shape by replacing the worst areas. So a good solution is to have a partial replacement component. And that may be a percentage or a particular dollar amount every few years. So remember that if this type of project is already happening from your operating budget, planning for the expense from reserves doesn't increase costs. It just brings peace to your association, knowing that you have the money set aside to get it done without unsettling your unscheduled operational contingency budget every few years. And maintenance is another common question. A reserve component doesn't need to be a literal replacement. Most components need normal maintenance, but normal daily, weekly, monthly maintenance, like carpets being vacuumed and gutters and drains being cleared out, those should be funded through your operating budget because they occur throughout the year. But some major components, like the cooling tower in the picture, they need expensive maintenance every few years. A $20,000 refurb project at the 10-year point is going to help your $150,000 cooling tower make it all the way to its 20-year design useful life. So Significant scheduled maintenance passes the 4-part test because it's common area maintenance responsibility, it's on a scheduled interval with a predictable remaining useful life, and it's a significant cost. All right, do you replace something that's still working? Now, outside of a few cases that I'll have a link to in the outline, you should repair or replace a component when it needs it, not just because it's listed in your reserve study. So decide what's best for the association. Reserve study is a projection of association needs. It's not a binding schedule. Like here, this is a pool. On the right is the pool heater. Wait till that fails. You can see rust at the bottom. No need to do that proactively. But on the left is the boiler for the residential units. You don't want that to fail and for residents to be left without hot water for a few days while that gets repaired. So there will be some cases where you do the project after it fails, and some cases where you do the project when it's getting close to failure. Do the project when it's best for your association. And can you or should you ever expend reserves on a minor repair? And the answer is yes, if it extends the component's useful life. If something's broken locally, by all means fix it from the operating budget. But if a local repair means that the component will last a few years longer than previously planned, that's a legitimate use of reserve funds. Look at the picture here. This old fence is nearing the end of its life. But if installing a few new posts in a few key locations for a few $100 means you can delay replacing the entire $25,000 fence for another year or two, spend the money from reserves and extend the remaining useful life in your next update. That effectively bought you some reserve life. And note that there's some components that can be reserve components at one association or an operating expense at another. Pool furniture is a common example. If you replace your entire set every 5 years, it qualifies as a reserve expense. But if you replace a piece at a time, here or there, it's an operating expense. Either way, of course, the net expense is the same. It just comes from your right pocket or your left pocket. So set your reserve component list to fit the spending style of your association and the 4-part test. Don't just blindly do what another association is doing. It may not be appropriate for your association. And how much detail is appropriate? Well, the question is, do you list everything separately, everything with a different reserve component? So look at this picture. You see in this rec room furniture, flooring, a pool table, walls that need to be painted, lighting, and around the corner to the right is a small kitchen with a refrigerator and stove. We recommend not being too detailed because too much data can become clutter. And besides, it's better for your association to think along the lines of refurbishment, meaning grouping projects that are all best done at the same time, like having one component for all new furniture. Now, it's good to know how many tables and chairs and bar stools you have, but they don't need to be separate components if they're all going to be replaced at the same time. Should you budget for insurance deductibles? Different areas of the country have unfortunate regular exposure to things like wildfires, flooding, hailstorms, hurricanes, or earthquakes. And going back to the 4-part test, the answer is these insurance deductibles should not appear in the reserve study. And the reason, hopefully you're thinking along these lines, is because such expenses fail both the useful life test and the remaining useful life test. You can't predict when these expenses will occur. So these expenses are true surprises. Okay? And last poll of the day. I want to pose this to you before I show the next slide. Paige, can I get you to cue this one up? Can you reserve for painting even though the IRS says painting is not a capital project?
All right, the votes are coming in. All right, Robert, it looks like 76% say yes, 18% say it depends.
Oh, I like that. I like that very much. Okay, let me talk about that. We hear regularly from people who say the IRS says we can't reserve for painting. And what I want to make clear is that that you can reserve for painting when it's appropriate. Reserve planning is not limited by IRS regulations. Prepare your taxes according to IRS regulations and prepare your reserve study per National Reserve Study standards. It's as simple as that. If a project passes the 4-part test, it's a reserve component no matter what IRS regulations say. IRS regulates taxes, not reserves. So at your association, if you paint on an ongoing basis with in-house staff, then maybe that's appropriate for the operational budget. If you paint every few years as a major expense, then that starts to look like something that passes the 4-part test. Okay, and finally, just weeks after you've published your reserve study, it goes out of date. Your components are in a different condition than they were when the report was finished, and your reserve balance has probably drifted away from projections. 2 of the 3 types of reserve studies defined in National Reserve Study Standards are updates. So for most associations, reserve contributions are one of their largest budget line items. So update your assumptions and projections regularly. Annually is best. So stay on top of your planning. Don't let it get years and years behind. And here's a teaser of the links that we'll have in the outline to some other common issues. The important distinction between a capital improvement and a reserve project, National Reserve Study Standards, and an answer to what I spoke about earlier. Do you wait or are you proactive on replacing some of your components? And another free resource available through our outline is our ebook on reserve components. It's a reader-friendly booklet addressing component issues. And if you enjoyed this program, we'd like to invite you to our next 2 webinars. One will be Reserve Studies 102, the follow-up to this webinar that addresses the financial analysis of the reserve study. And the other is going to be an all-new program we're developing called the Case for Adequate Reserves. And we are putting that together based on your feedback, and that program will prepare you to effectively make the case to your members for adequate reserve contributions. And with this one, and I should say, as with this one, we'll send an email notification of the date of the webinar. And if you're not getting our email notifications, by all means go to reservestudy.com, scroll down to the bottom of the page, and sign up for our email list so you don't miss the announcement. At Association Reserves, we're aware that planning to have the funds ready when you need them is a multi-year journey. But we encourage you to think that it's a journey worth taking. You can get there, and if you want our assistance, we can guide you there. I thank you for joining us today, and I hope you find it was a good use of your time. We present these programs, and we've created all these resources to help as many associations as possible avoid common mistakes as they pursue an improved future. So in addition to these free resources, if you'd like our professional assistance, go to our website, www.reservestudy.com, and click the Request a Proposal link at the top right. It would be our pleasure to come alongside your association and guide you into the future. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will coordinate our Q&A time. Paige.